CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett joins us now. So, a new budget, tax reform, Major, that seems like something that theoretically should have bipartisan appeal, right? But in theory is different than practice. So just looking at the Republicans alone, are they single-minded in their support for this budget proposal?
They appear to be. In the House, they're going to move the Senate-passed budget resolution this week, accepting all the changes the Senate made without going into too many mind-numbing details. What that means is the House will take what the Senate wrote and not challenge it, meaning have a House and Senate conference, which would delay this process. So by passing the Senate budget this week on the House floor, that gives House and Senate tax writing committee members a couple of extra weeks to work on this. That means the House could, if everything goes as planned, pass this tax cut by Thanksgiving, giving the Senate the remainder of the month of December to finish up this work and possibly getting this legislation. Let me wait for the... There we go. Those are my friends with the National Park Service. They keep everything here immaculate, and we're very proud of them for doing so.
Absolutely.
So that would give the Senate the month of December, and quite possibly, again, if everything breaks just exactly right, this legislation could get to the president's desk by Christmas time. There's one important factor in between that. December 7th, spending authority for the federal government expires, which means there's going to have to be a bipartisan agreement on avoiding a government shutdown. That's the thing that could get in the way of this timeline. And it's also worth noting this morning the president took to Twitter to begin the process of rewriting a still unwritten tax cut, saying there will be no changes to 401k plans. There were several reports late last week that House Republicans, as writing this tax bill, were going to scale down the amount you could set aside tax-free for your 401ks from $18,000, which is acceptable law now, possibly down to as low as $2,500. Well, the president on Twitter said, forget about it. We're not changing that. Well, what are the implications of that? Well, the House Republicans were looking at this change in 401ks to find revenue. So these tax cuts wouldn't be so expensive and create short-term and possibly long-term deficit problems. If the president keeps along this road of taking away revenue that House Republicans are looking at to make this less damaging to the deficit, that could cause problems once this bill actually becomes known in its fullest and the deficit implications become not only politically realized but understood in the broad general public as well.
All right, to be continued on that end, Major, let's turn to health care. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, as you know, said he would bring the Alexander Murray bipartisan bill to the floor if President Trump says he will sign it. Now, that temporary fix would restore the subsidies the president is cutting. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, the president said, let's find a bipartisan solution. Remember, what is at the essence of this problem? The Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, National Park Service pause once again.
Our government at work.
The Affordable Care Act created subsidies so insurance companies could provide extra revenue to compensate for care it was providing for those who couldn't otherwise afford it. Those subsidies were never appropriated by Congress. House Republicans long ago went to court to sue that those subsidies couldn't be paid. Why? Because Congress never approved them. One more pause. The president kept paying those subsidies up until this month, ending them, essentially continuing what was regarded by many Republicans as an unconstitutional spending process for many months of his presidency. Well, now they're stopped. So the president said to Congress, find a way to make those subsidies appropriated by Congress. Senators Lamar Alexander, Republican, and Patty Murray, Democrat, did exactly that, following the president's advice and recommendation. But then when the president looked at the bill, he said, I like it, now I don't like it. And no one on Capitol Hill has any idea what the White House will accept to remedy this problem. So they're going to keep trying. But as Mitch McConnell said in the piece we just aired, he's not going to bring a bill to the floor until he knows what the president's going to sign. And at this moment, there's nobody in this building that can tell us what that is. So we're a bit at a disadvantage, and lawmakers trying to write legislation are at an even bigger disadvantage.
Major, before we let you go, I have to talk to you about John McCain's C-SPAN interview. It was on the Vietnam War, but he talked about the children of wealthy families getting deferments from the war. Let's listen to what he had to say.
One aspect of the conflict, by the way, that I will never, ever countenance is that we drafted the lowest income level of America, and the highest income level found a doctor that would say that they had a bone spur. That is wrong. That is wrong. If we're going to ask every American to serve every...
So, of course, Major, we know that the president received 5 deferments for bone spurs. But, you know, here we have John McCain, who's a pretty outspoken critic of the president, but he didn't say his name.
No.
And it sort of, we talked about this, Vlad, you know, neither did former presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush. When they spoke at sort of campaign events last week, they seemed to offer this veiled criticism, but they wouldn't directly say the president's name. So, I mean, what sort of impact can these critics or this sort of criticism have when they won't even say, and the president is guilty of this?
In all 3 cases, I believe President George W. Bush, President Obama, and John McCain all have a generalized understanding that you no longer need to say the president's name anymore. You can just state your criticism. It can be indirect, but everyone knows what you're talking about and pretty much the motivation behind it. What I would say is important to keep in mind on this is this feud between John McCain and President Obama could come back once the Senate begins to take on the details of the tax cut legislation. John McCain voted for the budget resolution, which will create the process for tax reform to go forward. But he and other Senate Republicans, Rand Paul, certainly he didn't vote for it, but he's a no vote. John McCain could be a no vote. Bob Corker of Tennessee could be a no vote. Why? Because they have a history of being skeptical of tax cuts and their deficit implications, have said so publicly. So there's a policy disagreement that is sort of beneath the surface, still kind of low level because there are no real details yet on this tax bill. But those underlying policy differences, when added to quite obvious personality differences, could be problematic for the president when tax cut legislation comes to the Senate and the president needs every Republican vote he can find.
Major Garrett at the White House for us. Thank you so much, Major.
Sure.